The platoon of M60s, led by Lieutenant Barry Davey of the 4th Battalion, 69th Armour Regiment, had proven themselves by successfully holding the extreme flank of their division's line. Now they had been retasked with launching a spoiling attack of their own against an enemy force, but first they'd have to break through the thin screen of scouts, preparing to call down artillery fire on any NATO units they came across. A mixed mechanised force made up of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles and APCs, and trucks were the target for Lieutenant Davies' platoon. These units were of the East German Army, and though armed with slightly older equipment, this force was still quite a potent, powerful force, and Lieutenant Davies' platoon was not expected to destroy it, but simply knock it about before they had a chance to launch their own attack. After quickly checking his maps, Lieutenant Davey ordered his platoon forwards. He knew there were a thin line of scouts ahead of him before he reached the main enemy force and wanted to punch through this screen right in the centre. From there, he could look down upon the main force from an elevated position, calling artillery and air support to destroy as many enemy vehicles as possible before they had the chance to spread out or move towards their objective. Lieutenant Davies' plan, however, was to be scuppered. A lone enemy aircraft would be passed, and Lieutenant Davies wasn't sure if his platoon had been spotted. The lone aircraft certainly gave no indication that they had been until a few minutes later when the platoon came under the attention of the enemy artillery. Lieutenant Davey quickly changed direction for his platoon's advance and almost immediately ran into one of the enemy's screening scout vehicles, which his own tank quickly dispatched. Quickly deploying smoke, the platoon moved on until it caught sight of a second enemy scout vehicle. This time, the enemy had spotted them, and the vehicle appeared to be running for the cover of the main force, dipping away on the other side of the hill before any of Lieutenant Davies' men could lay onto it. Advancing in pursuit of this one vehicle, moving around out into the open, Lieutenant Davies suddenly came into full sight of the enemy force. It had indeed advanced quite some way from where NATO scouts had placed it, and Lieutenant Davies quickly got to work calling in support, airstrikes and artillery. But he just had time to call in an airstrike when his tank was hit and he was killed. Lieutenant Davey, together with his gunner, Corporal Madison, were just two young men added to the ever-growing list of NATO casualties. Another of the platoon's tanks had also received a catastrophic blow and was on fire, and two crew members from that tank also failed to escape. Corporal Pierce, the tank commander from one of the other tanks, now took over what was left of the platoon, two M60s, against a company-sized force. He quickly took over, calling in Allied support, before moving into a position to engage the enemy force and provide cover for the wounded crew members from the other two tanks to extricate themselves from their wreckage. The enemy's artillery had also re-zeroed, and rounds were landing close to the American tanks. And though the survivors of the platoon wanted nothing more than to beat a retreat and get out of there, Corporal Pierce knew they had to cause some damage to this enemy company before it could advance. His gunner's first shot utterly destroyed the target, blowing off the turret as the ammunition ignited. The East German forces were now scattering before them, the vehicles spreading out, losing their cohesion, and as they moved, Corporal Pierce's gunner continued to engage, sighting target after target and firing with deadly effect. Though of course Corporal Pierce and his crew didn't realise it at the time, it turns out that their gunner was something of a sharpshooter with the M60's gun. Every single shot he fired hit a target, though of course neither he nor anyone else in his tank's crew were even aware of this. At long last, Corporal Pierce decided that they had dealt enough damage to the East German forces and called a retreat, calling the only other surviving M60 from the platoon to break contact and pull back to the rendezvous point. This, the last two tanks of the platoon succeeded in doing. The platoon had had 4 men killed, including the platoon commander, But the East German forces had been completely demoralised, their attack thrown off. They had lost 7 vehicles, tanks and IFVs mostly, and nearly a dozen men killed. A successful operation by Lieutenant Davies' platoon, but ultimately a costly victory. Elsewhere within 8th Infantry Division's sector, 2 platoons of reconnaissance troops were preparing for their next mission. Number 1 platoon, made up of 2 M2 Bradleys, were to push through enemy picket lines in a reconnaissance in force, continuing on until they met the main enemy line of resistance. Effectively, this was a probing attack, or rather a raid, and many villages across the countryside were at this time occupied by powerful enemy forces. Number 1 platoon set off, whilst Number 2 platoon would remain behind to provide support if needed. The 2 Bradleys of Number 1 platoon strung out into column in order to pass through the forest that flanked the road on both sides. A rather risky move of course, but it helped them approach unseen by the enemy. However, just before cresting the hill, the leading Bradley slowed to have a good look through the optics to see if any enemy troops were visible from their current position, and indeed, enemy armoured vehicles appeared to be in defensive positions around the nearby village. The lead Bradley, under the command of Sergeant Morris, brought its 25mm gun to bear and opened fire on an enemy APC, quickly knocking it out. But Warsaw packed forces in and around the village called in artillery support on the road leading through the forest. Sergeant Morris was not very enthusiastic about leading 2 Bradleys up the road through artillery shell fire, which with each shot got closer and closer to their target, and so he ordered the vehicles off the road and into the trees, turning left, pushing in through the forest, all the way through the trees and out the other side into the open field. The enemy artillery continued to fall upon the road where they had proceeded through the woods in the first place, and now the reconnaissance platoon was separated from the village by dead ground, which would soon prove extremely useful, as enemy armoured vehicles in the village began attempting to engage the 2 Bradleys as they came into sight. Sergeant Morris's gunner laid down a good burst of fire from 25mm cannon, and Sergeant Morris ordered his driver to floor it, pushing down the hill and into the dead ground into safety. The Soviet armoured vehicle's weapon was not likely to penetrate the Bradley's armour, but it could cause damage to important parts of the Bradley, the sight or the gun for example. Having moved up the other side of the dead ground, Sergeant Morris's Bradley was able to open fire upon the enemy vehicle blocking the main road through the village from an ad hoc hold down position in which the enemy's own gun could not be brought to bear upon them. And indeed, from this same position, Sergeant Morris's Bradley was able to engage other enemy vehicles around the village, without them being able to return effective fire at all. One of the more dangerous enemy positions around the village was in fact a lone infantryman armed with a guided anti-tank missile system. And it took a handful of bursts, but at last, Sergeant Morris's gunner managed to walk high explosive 20mm rounds onto this new target. With no further enemy positions visible from their position, Sergeant Morris ordered his platoon to advance, taking a quick look through the red-hot sight just to make sure nothing stirred around the village. He was also quite concerned with their right flank, the trees, blocking any possible enemies that might be lurking in that direction. And it's just as well that Sergeant Morris and his gunner were paying attention to this direction, because as they passed by the edge of the forest on the way to the village, a pair of enemy armoured personnel carriers came into view. And Sergeant Morris's gunner quickly fired the gun with APDS rounds loaded, smashing the vehicle, setting it ablaze very quickly, before traversing the gun right and engaging the second target. Neither were able to get the shot off before they were destroyed. At last, the platoon reached the village, which had been occupied by the Soviet mechanised patrol, and there were of course now several vehicles, abandoned or burning. But one still remained. This vehicle, aiming directly at Sergeant Morris's Bradley, should have got the drop on them. It was waiting in ambush. But once again, the quick action of Sergeant Morris's gunner destroyed it before it had a chance to fire off any rounds. Whilst Sergeant Morris's crew restocked the ready ammunition lockers with APDS rounds, they came under artillery fire once again, and it became necessary to push on. Even a near miss could cause considerable damage to a Bradley. Pushing on further north, Sergeant Morris came directly into contact with the outer pickets of the main Soviet line, and once again opened fire with his 25mm cannon. The second Bradley was coming under fire from a second APC and suffered damage to its sight, but the combined firepower of the two Bradleys knocked out the vehicle and its crew. Pushing on now to a very slight ridge, Sergeant Morris's men now found themselves in a bit of a predicament. They had received word that an armoured force of approximately a platoon strength of tanks was approaching their position and they were to withdraw, but the ground behind them was open field. The position they currently occupied actually afforded them a very small amount of obstruction from the enemy direction. If they were to withdraw now, the enemy tanks would crest the hill and shoot down upon them while they were out in the open. They might be able to reach the village, but the village behind them was also under artillery fire, and an additional battery had been brought to bear, raining down rounds almost on top of Sergeant Morris's platoon's position, obliging the two Bradley commanders to continuously change their positions. At long last, the turret of one of the enemy tanks came into view. It seemed as if this armoured platoon had not spotted Sergeant Morris's men yet, and so they stalked the Bradleys forward, preparing to fire their tow missile launchers. The first tank in view appeared to be observing the destroyed armoured personnel carriers nearby when Sergeant Morris's first missile slammed into the side of the turret, knocking out the crew. Sergeant Morris's second missile unfortunately went haywire and landed harmlessly in the field nearby, and it became necessary to reload the launcher before another missile could be fired. And to make matters worse, the second Bradley had a damaged sight they could not engage and be certain of a hit. In the end, Sergeant Morris and his men had to patiently keep calm whilst reloading the tow launcher and prepare to strike. At last, the launcher was ready, and they fired their third round straight into the front of the nearby enemy tank, stopping it in its tracks, before quickly traversing right, sighting the third tank and firing again their fourth shot, once again slamming into the side of the tank, instantly knocking it out, killing the crew. The heavy armoured counterattack had been stopped. It would now be safe for Sergeant Morris and his men to withdraw and pull back to the rendezvous point. Once again, small NATO units had hit far above their weight. The small two-vehicle patrol had knocked out 13 enemy vehicles, including 3 main battle tanks, and all for the loss of a damaged sight on one of the Bradleys, and that would be fairly easily fixed. Sergeant Morris and his men had done very well, just as the tankers from the 69th Armour Regiment had also performed well despite their losses. But NATO had started jabbing back at their enemy, chipping away at the enemy's strength. The strategy was for these small shaping operations to eventually lead on to a major counter-offensive, but that is a story for another day.